culture, and the modern world. We find evidence of print everywhere around us, in books, journals, newspapers, prints of famous paintings, and also in everyday things like theatre programs, official circulars, calendars, diaries, advertisements, cinema posters at street corners. We read printed literature, see printed images, follow the news through newspapers, and track public debates that appear in print. We take for granted this world of print and often forget that there was a time before print. We may not realize that print itself has a history which in fact shaped our contemporary world. In this chapter, we will look at the development of print from its beginnings in East Asia to its expansion in Europe and in India. We will understand the impact of the spread of technology and consider how social lives and cultures changed with the coming of print. The earliest kind of print technology was developed in China, Japan, and Korea. This was a system of hand printing. From AD 594 onwards, books in China were printed by rubbing paper, also invented there, against the inked surface of wood blocks. As both sides of the thin porous sheet could not be printed, the traditional Chinese accordion book was folded and stitched at the side. Superbly skilled craftsmen could duplicate with remarkable accuracy the beauty of calligraphy. The imperial state of China was, for a very long time, the major producer of printed material. China possessed a huge bureaucratic system which recruited its personnel through civil service examinations. Textbooks for this examination were printed in vast numbers under the sponsorship of the imperial state. By the 17th century, as urban culture bloomed in China, the uses of print diversified. Print was no longer used just by scholar officials. Merchants used print in their everyday life as they collected trade information. Reading increasingly became a leisure activity. This new reading culture was accompanied by a new technology. Western printing techniques and mechanical presses were imported in the late 19th century as Western powers established their outposts in China. Shanghai became the hub of a new print culture, catering to the Western-style schools. From hand printing, there was now a gradual shift to mechanical printing. India and the world of print. Manuscripts before the age of print. India had a very rich and old tradition of handwritten manuscripts in Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian, as well as in various vernacular languages. Manuscripts were copied on palm leaves or on handmade paper. Pages were sometimes beautifully illustrated. They would be either pressed between wooden covers or sewn together to ensure preservation. Manuscripts continued to be produced till well after the introduction of print, down to the late 19th century. Manuscripts, however, were highly expensive and fragile. They had to be handled carefully, and they could not be read easily, as the script was written in different styles. So manuscripts were not widely used in everyday life. Even though pre-colonial Bengal had developed an extensive network of village primary schools, students very often did not read texts. They only learned to write. Teachers dictated portions of texts from memory, and students wrote them down. Many thus became literate without ever actually reading any kinds of texts. Print comes to India. The printing press first came to Goa with Portuguese missionaries in the mid-16th century. Jesuit priests learned Konkani and printed several tracts. By 1674, about 50 books had been printed in the Konkani and in Kannada languages. Catholic priests printed the first Tamil book in 1579 at Cochin, and in 1713 the first Malayalam book was printed by them. By 1710, Dutch Protestant missionaries had printed 32 Tamil texts, many of them translations of older works. The English language press did not grow in India till quite late, even though the English East India Company began to import presses from the late 17th century. From 1780, James Augustus Hickey began to edit the Bengal Gazette, a weekly magazine that described itself as a commercial paper open to all, but influenced by none. So it was private English enterprise, proud of its independence from colonial influence, that began English printing in India. Hickey published a lot of advertisements, including those that related to the import and sale of slaves. But he also published a lot of gossip about the company's senior officials in India. Enraged by this, Governor General Warren Hastings persecuted Hickey and encouraged the publication of officially sanctioned newspapers that could counter the flow of information that damaged the image of the colonial government. By the close of the 18th century, a number of newspapers and journals appeared in print. There were Indians too, who began to publish Indian newspapers. The first to appear was the weekly Bengal Gazette, brought out by Gangadhar Bhattacharya, who was close to Ram Mohan Roy.